Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. Tonight, we travel northward, to a land where the light dances strangely across the sky, where winter darkness stretches long and summer sun refuses to set, where the earth meets the sea in 1,000 jagged embraces. We journey to the world of the Norse people, those seafarers and farmers we have come to call Vikings, and we ask a question that might seem simple at first, but opens like a flower into something much more beautiful. We ask, how did they sleep? How did they rest? What was it like to close one's eyes in that world, so different from our own, and drift into dreams beneath northern stars? This is not merely a question of beds and blankets, though we will speak of those things too. This is a question about the rhythm of life itself, about how human beings find peace when the world around them demands so much. The Norse people, after all, lived lives of considerable labor. They farmed stubborn soil, sailed treacherous seas, built their homes with their own hands, and faced winters that could be unforgiving. Yet within this demanding existence, they cultivated something we might recognize, something that speaks across the centuries to our own exhausted hearts. They understood rest. They honored it. They wove it into the very fabric of their days and nights. Let us begin, as we often must, with the land itself. Imagine, if you will, the fjords of Norway, those deep channels carved by ancient glaciers, where mountains rise so steeply from the water that they seem to guard the valleys like silent sentinels. The water below is dark and cold, reflecting the sky like polished stone. In summer, these places know a light that seems almost impossible, the sun circling the horizon but never quite disappearing, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that last for hours. In winter, the opposite occurs. Darkness settles over the land like a blanket, broken only by the dancing curtains of the aurora borealis, those northern lights that the Norse called the bridge to the gods. In such a place, time itself feels different. The seasons do not transition gently as they might in more temperate lands. Instead, they announce themselves dramatically, each bringing its own rhythm, its own demands, its own kind of rest. The people who lived here, scattered in small farmsteads along the coasts and valleys, learned to move with these rhythms rather than against them. They learned when to work with furious energy and when to settle into quieter pursuits. They learned that survival itself depended on this wisdom, this ability to read the land and sky and adjust accordingly. The typical Norse household was centered around the longhouse, a structure that has captured our imagination for good reason. Picture a building stretched long and low, its walls made of timber or stone or turf, depending on what the land provided. The roof, steeply pitched to shed the heavy snows, was often covered with living sod, so that in summer, grass and flowers grew there, as if the house itself were part of the earth. Inside, the space was divided not by walls but by function and custom, with the center dominated by a long hearth that ran much of the building's length. This hearth was the heart of everything. It provided warmth, light, and the means to cook food. But more than this, it was the gathering place, the spot where the family would come together after the day's labor was done. The fire burned with wood carefully gathered and dried, and on the coldest nights, it would be tended through the darkness by whoever happened to wake, adding another log to keep the flames alive and the cold at bay. The smoke from this fire rose upward, seeking escape through a hole in the roof or through the porous thatch, and though we might imagine this made the interior unpleasantly smoky, the Norse were skilled at managing their fires to minimize this, and the gentle haze that did remain was simply part of the atmosphere, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and whatever meal had been prepared. Along the walls of the longhouse, raised platforms ran the length of the building. These were the benches, the seats during the day and the beds at night. They were typically made of wood, sometimes simply planks laid across supports, sometimes more carefully crafted. Upon these platforms, the family would arrange their sleeping spaces. The concept of a private bedroom was largely unknown in this world. Instead, people slept communally, in the same great room where they ate and worked and gathered. This was partly practical, heat was precious, and clustering together around the central hearth made sense in every way. But it was also cultural. Privacy, as we understand it, was not particularly valued. Community was. The bedding itself tells us much about Norse life and priorities. The foundation was often straw or dried grasses, gathered in abundance during the brief but productive summer and stored carefully against the long winter. This straw was piled onto the wooden platforms to provide cushioning and some insulation from the hard surface beneath. Upon this base, the Norse laid skins and furs, the pelts of sheep, reindeer, bear, seal, and whatever other animals they had hunted or raised. These furs were not merely decorative, they were essential technology, trapping warmth and creating a cocoon against the cold. For those of higher status, there might be woolen blankets as well, woven by the women of the household during the long winter months when outdoor work was limited. Norse wool was particularly well suited to this climate, coming from hardy sheep breeds that had evolved to survive in harsh conditions. The wool retained its insulating properties even when damp, and it could be woven into textiles of varying weights and densities. Some blankets were heavy and thick, providing maximum warmth. Others were lighter, suitable for summer or for layering. The colors varied too. Undyed wool came in shades of white, gray, brown, and black, depending on the sheep. But wool could also be dyed with plants and minerals, creating reds and blues and yellows and greens, so that even in this practical object, there was room for beauty. The wealthiest households might even have linen sheets, made from flax that was grown in the more southern regions or obtained through trade. Linen was a luxury, requiring significant labor to produce, but it was valued for its smoothness and coolness against the skin. It was often used in summer, or by those who could afford multiple layers of bedding for different seasons and purposes. Pillows, as we know them, were not universal. Many Norse people simply used bundled clothing or folded furs to support their heads. But some had actual pillows, stuffed with down from eider ducks or other birds, or with wool or dried moss. These were softer, more comfortable, and another sign of relative prosperity. The very idea that one might have a special object solely for supporting the head during sleep speaks to a culture that understood comfort, that saw value in small refinements that made rest more pleasant. Now, let us consider the act of sleep itself, the moment when the household settled for the night. As darkness fell, which in winter might be as early as mid-afternoon, the family would gather around the hearth. The day's work was done. The animals were secured in their portion of the longhouse or in separate buildings nearby. The doors were barred against the wind and any unwelcome visitors. The fire was built up, providing both light and warmth. This was the time for eating, for conversation, for storytelling, for the weaving and mending and small crafts that could be done by firelight. The Norse were enthusiastic storytellers. In a world without books, without television, without any of the distractions we take for granted, stories were entertainment, education, and cultural preservation all at once. The sagas tell us of great heroes and distant adventures, but around the ordinary hearth, the stories would have been more varied. There would be tales of the gods and their exploits, certainly, stories that everyone knew but that never grew old in the retelling. Odin's quest for wisdom, Thor's battles with giants, Freya's beauty and magic, Loki's tricks and their consequences. These stories provided moral instruction, entertainment, and a framework for understanding the world. but there would also be more personal stories. Tales of ancestors, of great-grandparents who had come from elsewhere or who had done notable things. Stories of local events, of feuds and friendships, of good harvests and hard winters survived. Stories of the sea, of voyages taken, of lands glimpsed on the horizon. Every person had stories to tell, and the long dark evenings were the time for telling them. Music too filled these spaces. The Norse had various instruments, though much of their music is lost to us now, surviving only in fragments and descriptions. There were flutes made from bones or wood, producing haunting melodies that must have seemed to capture something of the wind itself. There were simple stringed instruments, precursors to the lyre and the harp. There were drums and rattles for rhythm. And of course, there was the human voice, singing songs that ranged from the solemn to the bawdy, from hymns to the gods to work songs to lullabies. It was in this atmosphere, warm and companionable, filled with firelight and voices, that the transition to sleep would begin. There was no single moment when everyone decided to sleep. Rather, people drifted toward it gradually. A child would grow drowsy and curl up on the bench, nestled in furs. Others would follow, one by one, as conversation softened and eyes grew heavy. The elderly might retire first, or the very young, while those in their prime might stay up later, tending to final tasks or simply enjoying the peaceful hour. When someone was ready for sleep, they would move to their designated spot on the sleeping benches. Each family member had their place, determined by age, status, and sometimes gender. The head of the household and his wife typically occupied the most prestigious position, often at the center or at the far end of the longhouse, the spot that received the best heat from the fire and was furthest from the drafty door. Children would be nearby, where they could be easily watched and comforted. Servants or enslaved people, if the household had them, would sleep in less favorable positions, perhaps closer to the door or in spaces with less access to the fire's warmth. People slept in their clothes, or in clothes very similar to what they wore during the day. The concept of specialized sleepwear was not part of this culture. They might remove their outer layers, their boots, their belts, and jewelry, but the inner tunic and trousers remained. This was practical in several ways. It provided an extra layer of warmth, it meant one was somewhat prepared if there was an emergency in the night, and it simply made sense in a world where undressing and dressing was more cumbersome than it is for us, with our modern fasteners and elastic. Once situated on the bench, wrapped in furs and blankets, surrounded by family, with the fire crackling softly and the darkness held at bay, sleep would come. And here we might pause to consider what sleep meant in this context, how different it was from our modern experience. The Norse did not sleep through the night in one long block as we are encouraged to do. Instead, their sleep was often segmented, divided into what historians call first sleep and second sleep. This pattern, common across much of the pre-modern world, involved sleeping for several hours after nightfall, then waking naturally for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then sleeping again until morning. During that wakeful period, people might tend the fire, check on the animals, use the bathroom facilities such as they were, engage in quiet conversation or prayer or lovemaking, or simply lie peacefully in the darkness, thinking their private thoughts. This was not insomnia, it was simply how sleep naturally structured itself when humans were not subject to electric lights and rigid schedules. In the Norse context, this middle-of-the-night waking had additional purposes. It was a time when someone could ensure the fire had not gone out, adding wood if necessary. It was a time to listen to the night, to be aware of whether wolves or other predators were moving nearby, whether the weather was changing, whether all was well with the world outside the walls. And then, having reassured themselves, having done what needed doing, they would return to their furs and drift back into sleep, often experiencing their most vivid dreams in this second cycle. The quality of this sleep, we might imagine, was quite good. Certainly, it would have been different from ours in various ways. There was likely more background noise, the breathing and snoring of family members, the crackling of the fire, the wind outside, the occasional sounds from animals. There were smells we would find unusual: wood smoke, unwashed bodies, animal furs, the earthy scent of the turf roof and walls. There was less complete darkness than we might achieve with our blackout curtains and controlled environments. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows, and even when the fire burned low, there was often some ambient light, especially in summer when darkness never fully descended. Yet despite, or perhaps because of all this, the Norse appear to have slept soundly. Their bodies were tired from genuine physical labor, the kind that leaves muscles pleasantly exhausted and ready for rest. They were not overstimulated by screens and lights and constant mental demands. Their minds, while certainly active and engaged with the challenges of their lives, were not bombarded with the information overload we experience. When they lay down to sleep, there was a natural readiness, a body and brain prepared to rest. The darkness of winter, which might seem depressing to us, actually served a purpose in this rhythm. With so few hours of daylight, there was a natural tendency to sleep more, to spend longer periods in rest. This was not laziness, it was adaptation. During the winter, there was less that could be done anyway. The fields were frozen, the seas were dangerous, travel was difficult. It made sense to conserve energy, to rest more, to gather strength for the intensive labor that summer would demand. The Norse embraced this seasonal variation in sleep, allowing their bodies to follow natural rhythms rather than fighting against them. In summer, the opposite occurred. With nearly constant daylight, people slept less, worked more, took advantage of every available hour to plant, to tend, to harvest, to sail, to build, to accomplish all the tasks that the short growing season demanded. This was exhausting, certainly, but it was balanced by the knowledge that winter's rest would come. The cycle continued, year after year, generation after generation, a rhythm as old as the land itself. Let us turn now to the children, for their sleep patterns and experiences tell us something important about Norse culture. Children were valued, treasured, seen as the future of the family and the continuity of the bloodline. But they were also expected to contribute to household labor from a young age, taking on tasks appropriate to their size and skill. A 5-year-old might help gather eggs or watch younger siblings. A 10-year-old might herd sheep or help with weaving. By their early teens, children were performing nearly adult work, learning the skills they would need throughout their lives. Yet despite these expectations, there was also gentleness toward children, especially the very young. Infants slept with their mothers, nestled close for warmth and easy feeding. The Norse practiced what we would now call co-sleeping, keeping babies near throughout the night. This was partly practical. In a cold climate, a baby needs the warmth of a larger body, but it was also affectionate. The bond between mother and child was recognized as important, and that bond was maintained through the night as well as the day. Young children had their own sleeping spaces on the benches, but they were always within sight and sound of their parents. A child who woke frightened in the night, troubled by bad dreams or by the sounds of wind and darkness, could call out and receive comfort. Parents would soothe them with soft words, with a hand stroking their hair, with the reassurance of presence. There were lullabies too, songs passed down through generations, melodies designed to calm and comfort, to ease a child from wakefulness into sleep. As children grew older, they gradually moved toward more independent sleep, but always within the communal structure. A teenage boy might sleep with his brothers, separate from his sisters but still in the same longhouse. A teenage girl would be watched carefully, kept close, her virtue protected. But all were still part of the household fabric, still sleeping in the shared space, still experiencing sleep as something done in community rather than isolation. This communal sleeping arrangement had profound effects on Norse psychology and culture. Sleep was not a private, individual experience but a shared one. People went to sleep knowing they were surrounded by their family, protected by numbers, warmed by proximity. There was security in this, a deep sense of belonging. It also meant that privacy for certain activities was limited, which shaped how relationships were conducted, how conflicts were managed, how intimacy was negotiated. Couples seeking privacy might slip away to the barn or, in warmer months, find a spot outdoors, but often they simply waited for the household to sleep and then loved quietly, discreetly, in the darkness. The elderly, too, had their place in this sleeping arrangement. In Norse culture, age brought status and respect. The old were valued for their wisdom, their memory of past events, their knowledge of how things were done. An elderly person would have a good spot to sleep, well heated, comfortable, and they would be cared for by younger family members. If they needed help during the night, if they were ill or struggling, there were people near to assist them. They did not face the isolation that many elderly people experience in our modern world. They slept and woke surrounded by family, part of the continuing cycle of generations. Now let us consider the furniture of sleep more closely, for it reveals much about Norse craftsmanship and values. The sleeping benches were often beautifully made, with carved decorations on the posts and edges. These carvings were not merely decorative, they told stories, displayed symbols of protection and prosperity, showed the household's connection to their gods and ancestors. A wealthy family might have benches carved with intricate interlace patterns, with images of dragons and serpents, with runes spelling out blessings or the names of those who had built the house. The wealthiest families, particularly the jarls and chieftains, might have something even more elaborate, a proper enclosed bed, called a rekja or sometimes referred to in translations as a box bed. This was a bed built into the wall or constructed as a piece of furniture, with sides and sometimes doors or curtains that could be closed. Inside this enclosure, piled high with furs and blankets, insulated from drafts and granted some privacy from the rest of the household, the lord and lady of the house would sleep. This was a sign of status, certainly, but it was also practical luxury. The enclosed bed was warmer, more private, more comfortable. It allowed for better sleep, for easier intimacy, for a small sanctuary within the larger communal space. Even in more modest households, there might be some attempt at division or enclosure. Curtains made of wool or linen could be hung to create semi-private sleeping alcoves. Decorative hangings might separate the sleeping area from the working area. These textiles served multiple purposes. They added warmth, reduced drafts, created a sense of coziness, and allowed for some degree of privacy within the shared space. They could be beautiful too, woven in patterns and colors, embroidered with designs that pleased the eye and spoke of the skill of the women who made them. The Norse understanding of cleanliness also affected their sleep. While it is sometimes assumed that medieval people were universally filthy, this is a misconception, especially regarding the Norse. They valued cleanliness highly, much more than many of their European contemporaries. They bathed regularly, often weekly or even more frequently. They had saunas, bath houses where they would steam and scrub themselves. They washed their hands and faces daily. They combed their hair and beards with care. This cleanliness extended to their sleeping arrangements. Bedding was aired regularly, taken outside and shaken or beaten to remove dust and debris. Straw was replaced when it became compressed or dirty. Furs were cleaned and maintained. The Norse had various methods for dealing with the pests that inevitably found their way into bedding, fleas and lice and bedbugs. Certain herbs were known to repel insects, and these might be scattered in the straw or woven into the bedding. Cleanliness was not just about comfort, it was about health, about respect for oneself and one's family, about maintaining the order and propriety that were valued in Norse society. Let us turn our attention now to the rhythms of the night itself, to what happened in the darkness between the settling into sleep and the rising with dawn. The Norse night was not silent. It was filled with sounds, some comforting, some neutral, some that might set hearts racing until they were identified and understood. The wind was a constant presence, especially in winter, howling around the corners of the longhouse, whistling through any gaps in the walls, making the whole structure creak and groan. To us, this might seem alarming, but to the Norse, these were familiar sounds, the voice of the world outside, no more disturbing than the sound of traffic might be to a modern city dweller. Inside, there were the sounds of family. The breathing of sleepers, deep and rhythmic. The occasional snore, the murmur of someone talking in their sleep, the cry of a baby needing comfort or feeding. There were the sounds of the animals in their section of the longhouse or in nearby buildings, the shifting of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the clucking of chickens settling on their roosts. These sounds were reassuring, evidence that all was well, that the livestock were safe and healthy, that the household's wealth and sustenance were secure. The fire made its own music. The crackle and pop of burning wood, the subtle roar of flames drawing air, the occasional shower of sparks when a log shifted. Someone would wake periodically to tend it, adding wood from the pile kept near the hearth, adjusting the logs with an iron poker, ensuring that warmth continued through the night. This task might fall to different people on different nights, or there might be an understood rotation. It was not a burden but a responsibility, a contribution to the household's comfort and safety. Outside, if one listened carefully, there were other sounds. The call of night birds, owls hunting in the darkness. In winter, sometimes the eerie crack and boom of ice forming or shifting on lakes and fjords. In summer, the rustling of wind through leaves, the distant sound of the sea if the household was near the coast. And sometimes, rarely but memorably, the sounds of other people, a traveler passing in the night, a neighbor's dog barking at some disturbance, voices carrying across the cold air from another farmstead. The Norse were aware that the night was not always safe. There were practical dangers, wolves, bears, the occasional human threat from raiders or thieves. But there were also supernatural concerns. The Norse believed that the night was when spirits were most active, when the boundaries between the worlds of the living and the dead, between the human realm and the realms of gods and monsters, grew thin. The spirits of ancestors might walk abroad. The landvetter, the spirits of the land itself, were about their business. More malevolent beings, draugr, restless dead who walked, or trolls who ventured from their rocky homes, might be encountered. This belief shaped behavior. People did not venture out at night casually. If one had to leave the house after dark, one did so carefully, perhaps carrying a torch, certainly with awareness and respect for what might be out there. The household gods, the Dazur, and other protective spirits, were honored and propitiated, asked to watch over the sleeping family, to guard the home against both physical and spiritual threats. Small rituals might be performed before sleep, prayers offered, protective symbols checked. Yet despite these concerns, or perhaps because of the measures taken to address them, the Norse slept peacefully. The walls of the longhouse were not just physical barriers but symbolic ones, marking the boundary between the domestic and the wild, between the safe and the dangerous. Inside was order, warmth, family, protection. Outside was the unknown. This clear boundary was psychologically important. When one closed the door and barred it for the night, one was declaring that the household was secure, that the time for wariness was over, that rest could be embraced. Dreams were significant in Norse culture, seen as messages from the gods or glimpses of future events. A vivid dream might be discussed in the morning, its symbols analyzed, its possible meanings debated. Some dreams were seen as prophetic, showing what was to come and allowing the dreamer to prepare. Others were understood as visits from the dead, allowing ancestors to communicate with the living. Still others were simply acknowledged as the mind's wanderings, meaningful or not depending on their content and the circumstances of the dreamer. There were people, particularly women, who were known for their ability to interpret dreams, to see the patterns and meanings within them. These women held a special status, consulted when dreams were particularly powerful or disturbing. Their interpretations could influence important decisions, whether to take a particular voyage, whether to pursue a certain course of action, whether to be wary of a specific person or situation. Dreams were not dismissed as mere fantasy but were integrated into the Norse understanding of reality, seen as one more source of knowledge and guidance. The transition from night to morning was gradual. In winter, with dawn coming late, the household might begin to stir while it was still dark, people waking naturally as their bodies had rested enough, or waking to tend the fire or the animals. There was no alarm clock, no external force demanding wakefulness at a specific time. Instead, people rose when their bodies were ready, when the day's tasks called them, when the light strengthened enough to make work possible. In summer, with the sun rising early or barely setting at all, the rhythm was different. People might wake with the light, which could be very early indeed, or they might sleep through the brightness, their bodies so accustomed to it that it did not prevent rest. Shutters or curtains might be closed to darken the sleeping area, allowing for rest even when the sun shone. But often, people simply adapted, accepting that summer meant less sleep, that the long days of light were a gift to be used, not resisted. The first tasks of morning were often done in a state of pleasant drowsiness, the mind not yet fully engaged, the body moving through familiar routines. Someone would build up the fire, adding wood and kindling, coaxing flames back to life. Someone else might go to fetch water, bringing it from the well or stream in buckets. The animals needed tending, cows to be milked, chickens fed, sheep led out to pasture. Breakfast would be prepared, usually something simple, porridge or bread, perhaps some dried fish or cheese, food that required little attention to prepare. As people moved through these tasks, they would gradually come fully awake. Conversation would start, plans for the day would be discussed, tasks would be assigned. Children would be roused if they had not woken naturally, encouraged gently, or more firmly depending on their temperament and the urgency of the day's work. The household would transition from the private, internal world of sleep to the public, active world of day, and the cycle would begin again. Let us consider now the seasonal variations in sleep more deeply, for they are central to understanding the Norse relationship with rest. The winter months, from roughly October through March in the northern regions, were characterized by long nights and short days. In the far north, there were even periods of complete darkness, when the sun did not rise at all for weeks or months. This darkness was profound, absolute in ways that are difficult for most of us to imagine. It shaped everything about Norse winter life. During these months, sleep extended naturally. People went to bed earlier, rose later, and often slept longer hours than they would in summer. This was not laziness but necessary adaptation. The cold was intense, fuel was limited, and staying warm required either activity or being wrapped in bedding. Since there was limited work that could be done outdoors, and even indoor work was hampered by the lack of light, it made sense to spend more time resting. The body itself seemed to crave this, to want to slow down, to conserve energy, to wait for the return of the sun. But winter sleep was not merely passive waiting. It was a time for other kinds of activity, for the work of the mind and spirit. This was when the longest stories were told, when the most elaborate crafts were undertaken, when people had time to think deeply about their lives and their world. The darkness, rather than being oppressive, became a kind of creative space, a time when imagination flourished. The sagas themselves, those great epic narratives of Norse literature, were likely refined and elaborated during these long winter nights, storytellers having the luxury of time to develop their tales, audiences having the patience to listen for hours. There was also a meditative quality to winter rest. The stillness of the land, the muffled quiet of heavy snow, the enclosed feeling of the longhouse with its small circle of firelight surrounded by vast darkness, all of this created an atmosphere conducive to contemplation. People thought about the year that had passed, about loved ones who had died, about the mysteries of existence. They connected with their gods through private prayer and meditation. they faced themselves in ways that the busy activity of summer did not allow. Spring brought a dramatic change. As the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher, as the ice broke and the earth thawed, energy returned to both land and people. Sleep shortened naturally, the body responding to the increased light. There was excitement in this, a sense of renewal, of possibility. The household's whole rhythm shifted. People were up earlier, to bed later, eager to make use of every hour of increasing daylight. This was the time for the hardest work of the year. Fields had to be plowed and planted. Buildings needed repair after the ravages of winter. Livestock that had been kept close were now taken to summer pastures. Ships that had been hauled ashore were made ready for sea. Every person in the household had urgent tasks, and sleep became something to be fit in around work rather than the other way around. Yet even in this busy time, the Norse maintained their respect for rest. They understood that exhausted people made mistakes, that pushing too hard led to injury or illness. They balanced the demands of the season with the needs of the body. Summer brought its own sleep challenges and pleasures. The nearly constant daylight meant that work could continue for as long as strength lasted. Farmers would be in the fields from early morning until late evening, making the most of the precious growing season. Sailors would use the favorable weather and calm seas to make voyages for trading or raiding. Children would be out of doors almost constantly, herding animals, helping with harvest, simply enjoying the freedom and warmth. Sleep in summer was often briefer, more fragmented. People might sleep for a few hours in the middle of the night, then rest briefly in the heat of midday if work allowed. The quality of sleep was different too, lighter, less deep, more easily interrupted. But this was accepted as part of summer's nature. The long winter rest had provided a foundation, and now was the time to draw upon that reserve of energy. And yet, even in the height of summer activity, there were moments of peace. The twilight hours, when the sun hung low on the horizon but did not set, had a magical quality. The light was golden and soft, the air cool and sweet. This was a time when people might pause in their work, might sit for a while and simply be, watching the play of light on water or mountain, feeling the gentle breeze, listening to birdsong. These moments of stillness, though brief, served as a kind of waking rest, refreshing the spirit even as the body remained active. Autumn was perhaps the most crucial season, a race against the coming winter to complete all necessary preparations. The harvest had to be brought in, preserved, stored. Animals were slaughtered and their meat smoked or dried. Additional firewood was cut and stacked. Clothing and bedding were checked and repaired. The roof might need attention before the snows came. Every task was undertaken with urgency, for the success of these efforts would determine how well the household survived the winter to come. Sleep in autumn took on a different quality. It was the sleep of the deeply tired, people working to exhaustion and then collapsing into rest so profound that they barely moved until morning. But it was also anxious sleep, haunted by worries about whether enough had been done, whether the stores would last, whether the animals would make it through, whether the family would be safe and fed when the darkness descended. These anxieties would ease as the preparations were completed, as the last sheaves were brought in and the final animal slaughtered. When the household finally barred the door against the first winter storm, there would be a collective sigh of relief, and sleep that night would be especially sweet. Let us turn now to consider special circumstances of sleep, for not all rest occurred in the longhouse, and not all members of the household slept in the same way at all times. There were variations and exceptions that reveal the flexibility and adaptability of Norse culture. Travelers, for instance, faced different sleeping arrangements. When journeying overland, they might seek hospitality at another household, relying on the Norse custom that required hosts to provide shelter and food to those who requested it. This hospitality was not merely courtesy, it was sacred duty, overseen by the gods themselves. To turn away a traveler who asked for shelter was to invite divine displeasure. so travelers could expect to find a place to sleep, usually on the floor near the fire, provided with at least a blanket if not furs, and fed from the household stores. When no household was near, travelers slept rough, making camp wherever seemed reasonably safe and sheltered. They might carry a tent, a simple structure of cloth or hide stretched over poles, or they might simply wrap themselves in their cloaks and sleep under the sky. In such circumstances, sleep was lighter, more watchful. One person would stay awake to keep the fire going and watch for danger while others slept, and they would take turns through the night. This was less restful, certainly, but it was temporary, and the hardship was accepted as part of the price of travel. Sailors faced their own challenges. On a longship, space was limited and comfort minimal. When on a voyage, the crew would sleep in shifts, some rowing or sailing while others rested. Those resting would curl up wherever they could find space, between the rowing benches, along the sides of the ship, sometimes in a tent-like structure rigged in the middle of the vessel. They would wrap themselves in cloaks, using their shields as makeshift windbreaks or rain shelters. Sleep on a ship was rarely comfortable. The vessel moved constantly with the waves, making rest fitful. The weather was often cold and damp. Yet sailors adapted, learning to sleep in snatches, to make the most of whatever rest was available. When sailors made landfall, they might pull the ship ashore and camp on the beach, or they might seek out a settlement and try to arrange more comfortable quarters. On longer voyages, particularly those to Iceland or Greenland or even North America, ships would stop regularly to allow the crew to rest properly, to cook hot meals, to dry their clothing, to recover strength before continuing. These stopovers were essential for maintaining the crew's health and morale, and experienced captains knew not to push their men beyond endurance. Warriors preparing for battle faced particular considerations regarding sleep. Before an engagement, it was important to be well rested, clear-headed, ready for the demands of combat. A wise leader would ensure his men had a good night's sleep before battle if at all possible. They would be fed well, their spirits lifted with songs and stories, their anxieties addressed and their courage bolstered. Sleep the night before battle might be difficult. Fear and anticipation kept many men awake, or troubled their dreams when they did sleep. But the attempt was made, and leaders understood that exhausted warriors were less effective, more likely to make fatal mistakes, more prone to panic. After battle, if they survived, men slept the sleep of the utterly spent. The adrenaline would drain away, leaving them hollow and trembling. Wounds would be tended, the dead would be honored, and then those who could would collapse into whatever rest was available. This post-battle sleep was often disturbed by nightmares, by the replaying of violence witnessed and committed, by grief for fallen comrades. Yet it was also healing, the body's natural response to trauma, attempting to process and integrate what had been experienced. Women's sleep had its own patterns and considerations. Women who were pregnant or nursing had different needs. Pregnancy brought fatigue, especially in the early and late stages, and pregnant women were often given permission to rest more, to take naps during the day, to avoid the heaviest labor. This was partly practical. A healthy mother meant a healthy child, but it was also an acknowledgement that pregnancy was itself a form of work, that the body was engaged in creating new life, and that this deserved respect and accommodation. Nursing mothers often experienced fragmented sleep, waking frequently to feed their infants. This was exhausting, but it was temporary, and the household often adjusted to support the mother. Other women might take on some of her daytime tasks, giving her opportunities to rest. The baby would be kept close at night, often sleeping against the mother's body, making nursing easier and requiring less disruption. As the child grew and nursed less frequently, the mother's sleep would gradually return to a more normal pattern. Women who were menstruating sometimes faced additional considerations. In some Norse households, there were beliefs about the power of menstrual blood, and menstruating women might be asked to avoid certain activities or spaces. These restrictions varied considerably by region and household, and we should be careful not to generalize too broadly. But where such customs existed, they might affect sleeping arrangements, with menstruating women perhaps sleeping in a separate area or following particular rituals. These practices were not necessarily punitive. Indeed, they might have been seen as protecting both the woman and the household from supernatural influences associated with this powerful time in a woman's cycle. The enslaved people in Norse households, those thralls whose labor supported the family's prosperity, had sleeping arrangements that reflected their status. They typically slept in the least desirable spots, near the door where drafts were worst, in corners away from the fire's warmth, or sometimes in separate outbuildings. Their bedding was minimal, perhaps straw and a single thin blanket, nothing like the furs and wool enjoyed by the free members of the household. Their sleep was often interrupted by demands from their owners, expected to rise at any hour to tend to needs or problems. This was one of the many hardships of enslavement, this denial of the basic dignity of restful sleep. Yet even within this system, there were variations. A thrall who had been with a household for many years, who was valued for particular skills or who had earned some degree of affection, might be given somewhat better sleeping arrangements. A thrall woman who was also a concubine to the household's master might sleep in a more comfortable location, at least on nights when she was required to be available to him. These small mercies did not excuse the fundamental injustice of the institution, but they remind us that even in systems of oppression, human relationships created complexity and variation. Let us consider now the spiritual dimensions of sleep, for the Norse understanding of rest was not purely physical. They believed that sleep was a time when the soul became more permeable, more open to influences from other realms. The barriers that kept the everyday world separate from the worlds of gods and spirits and the dead grew thin during sleep, allowing for communication and interaction that was not possible in waking life. Dreams, as we have mentioned, were one manifestation of this. But there were other beliefs as well. Some Norse people believed that during sleep, a part of the soul, called the huger or sometimes the hammer, could leave the body and travel. This traveling soul might journey to distant places, might observe events happening far away, might even interact with other spirits or with the traveling souls of other people. Upon waking, the person might remember fragments of these journeys as dreams, or might simply have a sense of knowledge gained, of things seen that they could not have witnessed with physical eyes. There were specialists, particularly women called vulvas or seer practitioners, who cultivated this ability, who could send their souls traveling deliberately while in trance states that resembled sleep. These women were respected and feared, for their power was considerable. They could see the future, could communicate with the dead, could cast spells and work magic. Their practices often involved entering states between waking and sleeping, using drums and chanting and sometimes herbs to facilitate the trance. What they did in these states was understood to be real, not metaphorical. They truly traveled, truly saw, truly influenced events through their spiritual journeys. For ordinary people, the traveling soul during sleep was less controlled but still significant. It meant that sleep was a time of vulnerability, for if the soul traveled too far or became lost, the person might sicken or even die. It also meant that sleep was a time of potential communication with loved ones who had died, for the dead existed in their own realm and sometimes the sleeping soul could reach them there. These visits from the dead in dreams were not usually frightening, they were often comforting, allowing for farewells that had not been possible, for advice from ancestors, for reassurance that those who had died continued in some form. Protective rituals before sleep took on added significance in this context. A prayer to the gods, particularly to Odin who presided over many forms of wisdom and magic, might ask for protection for the traveling soul during the night. Small charms might be placed near the sleeping area, runes carved into the bedpost or onto amulets worn around the neck. These were not mere superstition but genuine spiritual practice, taken seriously by people who believed that the unseen world was as real as the visible one. The morning upon waking was also a significant time spiritually. Having returned from the night's journey, having survived the dangers of the dark both physical and spiritual, there was cause for gratitude. Morning prayers or rituals might acknowledge this, thanking the gods for protection, honoring the spirits of the household, setting intentions for the day ahead. This created a kind of bookend structure to sleep, entering it with protection and awareness, leaving it with gratitude and purpose. Now let us consider the role of substances in Norse sleep. The Norse had access to various plants and preparations that could affect rest, and they used these with knowledge gained through generations of observation and experience. Alcohol was perhaps the most common sleep aid, though it was not typically used primarily for this purpose. Mead and ale were everyday beverages, safer to drink than water which might be contaminated, and also sources of nutrition and pleasure. But drinking in the evening, particularly drinking heavily as part of a feast or celebration, certainly aided sleep, causing people to drift off more easily and sleep more deeply, at least initially. The Norse were enthusiastic drinkers on festive occasions. Great halls would ring with laughter and song as horns of mead were passed around. Stories grew more elaborate, boasts more extravagant, emotions more freely expressed. As the night wore on and drinking continued, people would begin to fall asleep where they sat, slumping onto benches or sliding to the floor. Others would make their way unsteadily to sleeping quarters. The sleep that followed such drinking was heavy, often dreamless, and the morning would bring headaches and regret along with hazy memories of the night before. But this was exceptional, reserved for special occasions. For ordinary nights, alcohol consumption was more moderate, perhaps a cup of ale with the evening meal, enough to bring a pleasant relaxation but not enough to cause intoxication. This mild consumption may have aided sleep without the negative effects of heavy drinking. Various herbs were known to have calming properties. Chamomile, though it grew wild in some areas and was also cultivated, could be made into a soothing tea before bed. Valerian root, with its distinctive smell and powerful sedative effects, was known and used, though probably reserved for cases of genuine sleep difficulty or illness. Hops, which we associate now primarily with beer brewing, were also recognized for their sleep-inducing properties. Lavender, meadowsweet, and various other plants had their places in the Norse pharmacopoeia, used not as daily sleep aids but as remedies when rest was elusive or troubled. The knowledge of these plants was primarily held by women, particularly older women who had years of experience in managing household health. These women would know when to brew a particular tea, what combination of herbs would help a child with nightmares, what preparation would ease a woman through difficult menstruation or childbirth recovery, what would help an old person whose joints ache too much to allow rest. This knowledge was valuable, passed down through families, sometimes guarded carefully, other times shared generously. For pain relief that might aid sleep, the Norse had limited options compared to what we have today. Willow bark, which contains salicin, a compound related to modern aspirin, could be chewed or brewed into tea to reduce pain and inflammation. This might help someone sleep despite injury or illness. Beyond this, there was alcohol for its numbing effects, and there were various poultices and salves that could be applied externally. For serious pain, opium was known but rare, obtained through trade from distant lands and too precious to use except in extreme cases. The Norse also understood that what one ate affected sleep. A heavy meal shortly before bed made sleep uncomfortable, leaving people feeling overfull, sometimes causing indigestion or unpleasant dreams. But going to bed hungry was also unpleasant, leaving one restless and unsatisfied. The ideal evening meal was substantial enough to satisfy but not so heavy as to burden the stomach. It would typically be eaten several hours before sleep, giving time for digestion while still providing enough energy that hunger would not disturb rest. Certain foods were considered particularly conducive to good sleep. Warm porridge made from oats or barley, sweetened perhaps with honey, was comforting and filling without being heavy. Dairy products, milk, Yogurt like cultured milk called skyr, soft cheeses, were seen as calming. Root vegetables roasted in the embers of the fire were satisfying and nourishing. Fish and meat would typically be consumed earlier in the day when more energy was needed for digestion. The Norse also recognized that physical activity affected sleep. A day spent in hard labor, plowing fields, cutting wood, hauling nets, weaving at the loom, left the body pleasantly tired and ready for rest. But excessive exhaustion, the kind that came from pushing beyond reasonable limits, could actually interfere with sleep, leaving one too keyed up, muscles twitching and complaining, mind unable to settle. The wise approach was to work hard but not to the point of complete collapse, to pace oneself, to take breaks when needed. For children, physical activity was essential for good sleep. Children who had run and played and explored all day would sleep soundly, their growing bodies demanding rest to process the day's experiences and continue developing. Parents understood this, and even when children had chores to do, there was usually time for play as well, for running races and climbing trees and inventing games, all of which contributed to healthy tiredness by bedtime. Let us turn our attention now to the sounds that specifically aided Norse sleep, for the auditory environment was carefully managed even if unconsciously. The crackling of the fire, as we have mentioned, was a constant presence, and it was deeply soothing, a sign of warmth and safety, a white noise that masked other potentially disturbing sounds, a primitive comfort that spoke to something deep in the human brain about shelter and survival. But there were other sounds too that became sleep aids through their familiarity and associations. The breathing of family members, once one became accustomed to it, was reassuring rather than disturbing. It confirmed that all were present, all were well, that the household was complete and safe. The sounds of animals, the soft lowing of cattle, the sleepy clucking of chickens, were similarly comforting, evidence that the household's wealth and resources were secure. Outside sounds, too, became familiar. The particular way the wind moved around the buildings of one's own farmstead, the distant sound of a waterfall or stream if one lived near such features, the rhythm of waves if one lived by the sea, these became a kind of lullaby, their absence more disturbing than their presence. A person who traveled would sometimes have difficulty sleeping in a new place not because it was louder than home but because the sounds were different, unfamiliar, and therefore potentially threatening even when they were actually quite innocent. Silence, absolute silence, was actually somewhat unsettling to Norse ears accustomed to the constant small sounds of a living household. Complete quiet might suggest that something was wrong, that the fire had gone out or the animals had fled or some other disaster had occurred. A certain level of gentle background noise was expected, desired, conducive to rest because it confirmed that all was as it should be. Human voices in the evening, as we have discussed, were part of the transition to sleep. But even after most of the household had settled, there might be occasional soft conversation, someone murmuring to a spouse, a mother singing quietly to a child, an elderly person talking briefly with an adult child who slept nearby. These quiet voices, too intimate to carry beyond a few meters, were part of the soundscape of night. They were not disturbing but rather comforting, evidence of love and connection, the soft maintenance of bonds even in darkness. The Norse also had various verbal charms and prayers that might be spoken or sung at bedtime. Some of these were appeals to specific gods for protection. Others were more general blessings, asking for peaceful sleep, good dreams, and safe waking. Still others were folk charms, semi-magical verses that had been passed down for so long that no one quite remembered where they came from, but everyone knew they helped. A parent might whisper such a charm over a child's head, or a person might murmur one to themselves as they settled into sleep. There were also counting methods for inducing sleep, not unlike the counting sheep that later cultures developed. One might count one's blessings, listing silently all the good things in one's life: healthy children, adequate food, a sound roof, good neighbors. This practice served dual purposes. It was mentally calming, giving the mind something to focus on while releasing the day's concerns, and it cultivated gratitude, which the Norse believed was important for maintaining right relationship with the gods and with one's own luck or fate. Speaking of fate, we should consider the Norse concept of Wyrd and how it related to sleep. Wyrd was the idea that each person's fate was woven by the Norns, those powerful female beings who sat at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and determined the course of every life. This fate was not entirely predetermined. Norse philosophy allowed for agency and choice, but there were certain threads in the weaving that were fixed, certain events that would occur regardless of one's actions. Sleep was sometimes seen as a small death, a temporary surrender of consciousness and control, and thus a time when one was most directly in the hands of the Norns and the gods. To go to sleep was to trust, to release one's grip on waking life and accept whatever the night might bring. For people with a strong sense of Wyrd, this was not frightening but rather peaceful. If one's fate was to die in the night, then so it would be, and there was no point in resisting. If one was meant to wake, one would wake. This acceptance brought a kind of ease, a release from anxiety that many modern people, lacking such a framework, might envy. This is not to say that the Norse were fatalistic in a passive sense. They believed strongly in meeting one's fate with courage and honor, in shaping what could be shaped, in living well and bravely. But they also believed in accepting what could not be changed, in not wasting energy on futile worry. Sleep was one area where this acceptance was practiced nightly. One did what one could to ensure safety and comfort, said one's prayers, took one's precautions, and then surrendered to sleep without anxiety about what might happen. The Norse concept of honor also affected sleep in interesting ways. To die in one's bed of old age or illness was not shameful, but neither was it the most glorious end. The ideal death, for a warrior at least, was in battle, weapon in hand, dying bravely. This created an interesting relationship with sleep, for to die while sleeping was to die without awareness, without the chance to face one's end with courage. Some warriors might have felt a slight tension about this, awareness that each sleep could be their last and they would not even know it had come. Yet most people, most nights, did not think about such things. They simply went to sleep when tired and woke when rested, and the great philosophical questions about fate and death remained in the background, surfacing only occasionally in moments of deeper contemplation or during significant life events. Ordinary sleep was ordinary, for all its spiritual dimensions. It was simply what bodies did, what humans needed, a gift to be accepted gratefully. Let us consider now the elderly in more detail, for their experience of sleep tells us much about Norse culture's treatment of aging. As people grew old, their sleep often changed. They might sleep less deeply, waking more frequently during the night. They might need to urinate more often, requiring trips outside or to the household's indoor facilities. They might experience pain from arthritis or old injuries that made comfortable positions harder to find. They might have memories or regrets that troubled their rest, or they might simply find that their bodies no longer required as many hours of sleep as they once had. The Norse response to these changes was generally one of accommodation and respect. An elderly person who needed help getting up in the night would receive it without complaint. If someone needed extra padding for their sleeping space because their bones were closer to the surface and the hard bench hurt, it would be provided. If an old person wanted to sleep in a slightly different location, closer to the fire perhaps, or in a corner where they felt more protected, arrangements would be made. The elderly often became lighter sleepers, more aware of the household's nighttime activities. This was not seen as a problem but rather as another way they could contribute. An old person who woke frequently could tend the fire, could listen for problems, could be another set of eyes and ears keeping watch. Their accumulated wisdom was valued, so if something unusual occurred during the night, a strange sound, an animal behaving oddly, a change in the weather, their interpretation and advice would be sought. At the same time, the elderly were not expected to maintain the pace of younger people. If an old person needed to nap during the day, this was accepted. If they wanted to go to bed earlier or sleep later, they could do so without criticism. The Norse understanding was that the elderly had earned the right to rest, that they had worked hard throughout their lives and now deserved comfort and ease. This respect extended to all aspects of their care, including sleep. When an elderly person was dying, sleep took on new significance. The dying often slept more and more, the boundaries between waking and sleeping becoming increasingly blurred. Family would keep watch, staying near, sometimes holding the dying person's hand or speaking to them even when it was unclear if they could still hear. This vigil honored the person's life, acknowledged their importance to the family, and ensured they would not die alone. After death, the body would be prepared and laid out, and there would be a period of watching before burial or cremation. This watching had several purposes. It showed respect, it prevented any interference with the body by animals or ill-intentioned spirits, and it allowed family and community to begin processing their grief. During this time, people would take turns sleeping, never leaving the dead person unattended until they were properly sent on their way to the afterlife. The Norse believed in various afterlives, depending on how one died and what one had done in life. Warriors who died in battle might go to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where they would feast and fight and prepare for Ragnarok. Others might go to Freya's hall, Folkvanger. Many people would go to hell, which was not a place of punishment as later Christian hell would be, but simply the realm of the dead, a shadowy continuation of life that was neither particularly good nor particularly bad. And some believed that certain ancestors remained near their burial mounds, continuing to watch over their descendants and the land. These beliefs affected how the Norse thought about sleep, for sleep was seen as similar to death, a temporary parting of body and soul, a journey into other realms. To sleep well was to practice for death, to learn to release control and trust in the gods and fate. To wake each morning was a small return from death, a renewal of life, cause for gratitude. This perspective could make even ordinary sleep feel significant, weighted with meaning beyond mere physical rest. Let us consider now the practice of what we might call sleeping through difficulties, the Norse approach to enduring hardship through rest. When food was scarce, particularly toward the end of a hard winter when stores were running low, sleeping more was a survival strategy. Sleep required no calories. A body at rest consumed less energy than one active. So when there was not enough food, people would sometimes simply sleep more, conserving their strength, waiting for spring and the renewal of resources. This was not comfortable. Going to bed hungry was difficult, and waking hungry was worse. But it was survivable, and the Norse had generations of experience with such hardships. They knew the techniques, drinking water to fill the stomach somewhat, chewing on bits of leather or bark to give the mouth something to do, telling stories to distract from hunger, sleeping close together for warmth and comfort. They knew that this would end, that spring would come, that food would become available again. They endured, and sleep was part of their endurance. During illness, too, sleep was recognized as healing. A sick person was encouraged to rest as much as possible, sleeping long hours, allowing the body to direct its energy toward fighting the illness rather than toward work or activity. The household would adjust to accommodate this, others taking on the sick person's tasks, maintaining a quiet environment around the sleeping area, providing whatever comfort and care was possible. The Norse had limited understanding of disease mechanisms, but they understood empirically that rest helped. They saw that people who rested when sick often recovered, while those who tried to continue working often got worse. So they prescribed rest, along with whatever herbal remedies or other treatments they knew. A person with fever would be kept cool and given plenty of water. A person with a cough would be given steam to breathe and syrups to soothe the throat. And always, they would be told to sleep, to rest, to let the body heal. For some illnesses, there were beliefs that bad dreams or visits from malevolent spirits were part of the sickness. In these cases, protective measures would be taken, charms placed near the sleeping person, prayers said, offerings made to the gods. Sometimes a vulva or other spiritual practitioner would be called in to perform rituals intended to drive away whatever spiritual force was causing the illness. These practices coexisted with practical care, the Norse seeing no contradiction between physical and spiritual approaches to healing. The role of bathing in relation to sleep deserves our attention. The Norse love of cleanliness extended to regular bathing, and this had implications for rest. A person who had bathed was more comfortable, their skin clean and free of the day's sweat and dirt, their muscles relaxed from the warm water. Saturday was traditionally bath day. The Old Norse word laugardagr literally means washing day, and Saturday night's sleep was particularly pleasant after the week's accumulated grime had been washed away. The sauna or bathhouse was usually a separate building, heated with hot stones onto which water was poured to create steam. The experience was intensely hot, causing people to sweat profusely, opening pores and loosening muscles. Afterward, they might jump into cold water or roll in snow, then return to the heat, repeating the cycle several times. Finally, they would wash thoroughly with soap made from ash and animal fat, scrubbing away dead skin and dirt. This bathing ritual was physically exhausting but also deeply relaxing. The heat and the physical demands left one tired but in a pleasant way, the muscles loose and pliant, the skin glowing, the body clean and refreshed. That night's sleep, between clean linens or on fresh straw, was especially good. The Norse understood this connection, valued it, built it into their weekly routine. Hair care was also part of the pre-sleep routine for many Norse people. Hair would be combed carefully, removing tangles and any small debris. This was not purely cosmetic, it was also about cleanliness and the prevention of lice and other pests. Long hair might be braided for sleeping, keeping it neat and preventing tangles. Beards too would be combed and sometimes oiled. This grooming was calming, meditative, a quiet ritual that marked the transition from day to night. For women especially, hair care could be an extended ritual. Norse women often had very long hair, considered a mark of beauty and femininity. Combing this hair, perhaps with help from a daughter or sister, was a time for conversation, for connection, for the gentle, repetitive motion that calmed the mind. Sometimes herbs would be worked into the hair, not just for scent but also for their believed protective or beautifying properties. The Norse also understood the connection between temperature and sleep. They knew that being too cold made sleep difficult or impossible, so they took extensive measures to stay warm, multiple layers of bedding, sleeping close to others, maintaining the fire through the night. But they also knew that being too hot was uncomfortable. In summer, they might use lighter blankets or even sleep with minimal covering. They might open doors or windows to allow cooler air to circulate. The sleeping benches, being raised off the floor, helped with air circulation and temperature regulation. The enclosed beds used by wealthier families were designed with temperature in mind. The enclosure trapped warm air, creating a microclimate that was warmer than the surrounding room. In summer, the doors or curtains of these beds could be left open to prevent overheating. In winter, they would be closed, turning the bed into a cozy cave. The design was sophisticated, showing real understanding of how to create comfortable sleeping conditions in a challenging climate. Let us turn now to the question of sleep positions and what they can tell us. The Norse, like people everywhere, had their preferred ways of lying down to sleep. Some slept on their backs, arms crossed over their chests or lying at their sides. Others preferred to sleep on their sides, curled up somewhat, perhaps with knees drawn toward the chest in a position that conserved warmth. Still others might sleep on their stomachs, though this was probably less common given the typical bedding arrangements. Couples would often sleep close together, the warmth and comfort of another body being both practical and emotionally satisfying. They might sleep spooned together, one behind the other, or facing each other, or back to back. These sleeping positions were not just about temperature regulation, they were also about intimacy, about maintaining connection even in unconsciousness. The absence of a usual sleeping partner, when one was traveling or had died, would be keenly felt, the empty space a constant reminder. Children would often pile together, multiple siblings sharing a sleeping space, tangled up with each other like puppies. This closeness was normal, expected, and it contributed to strong sibling bonds. Children learned to sleep despite the movements and sounds of others, learned to share space and warmth, learned that they were part of something larger than themselves. These lessons carried into adulthood, making the communal sleeping arrangements of adult life feel natural rather than intrusive. The Norse did not typically sleep with pillows under their knees or between their legs as some modern sleep experts recommend, though some people might have discovered these positions independently and found them comfortable. They did not have the elaborate mattress technology that we have today, with its concerns about spinal alignment and pressure points. What they had was simpler, but it worked for them, evolved over generations to meet their needs in their context. Let us speak now of sleep and the cycles of human life, from infancy to old age, and how the Norse understood and accommodated these changing needs. Infants slept much of the time, waking primarily to nurse and then drifting back into sleep. New mothers learned to sleep lightly, to wake when the baby stirred, to nurse half asleep and then settle back into rest. This was exhausting, but it was also temporary, and mothers knew from seeing others go through it that eventually the baby would sleep for longer stretches. There were lullabies to help babies sleep, songs passed down through generations, their melodies designed to soothe and calm. These songs often had repetitive lyrics, simple and hypnotic, sometimes telling stories of the gods or heroes, sometimes just making pleasant sounds. A mother rocking her baby, singing softly, was a common sight in Norse households, as it has been in households everywhere throughout history. As children grew, their sleep consolidated into mainly nighttime rest with perhaps a daytime nap. Young children might still nap regularly, sleeping in the middle of the day when energy flagged. Older children would gradually give up these naps, staying awake through the full day, though they still needed more total sleep than adults. Parents understood this and would ensure children went to bed at appropriate times, even if the adults stayed up later. Adolescence brought new sleep challenges. Teenagers needed substantial sleep to support their rapid growth and development, but they also wanted to stay up with the adults, to be part of evening conversations and activities. Norse parents had to balance these competing needs, sometimes insisting that teenagers sleep even when they protested they were not tired. The wisdom of ensuring adequate rest for growing young people was well understood, even if the teenagers themselves did not always appreciate it. Young adults in their prime tended to need less sleep than teenagers but still required solid rest to support their intensive work and, for women, childbearing. This was the age of most responsibility, when people were working hardest, raising children, building their households and reputations. Sleep sometimes felt like a luxury, something to be squeezed in when possible, but those who neglected it paid the price in reduced effectiveness and increased illness. Middle age brought some relief from the most intensive demands, as children grew more independent and households became more established. Sleep could become more regular again, though it might also begin to change in quality as the body aged. Some people began to experience the lighter, more fragmented sleep that would characterize their later years. Now let us consider the sacred and special times of year and how they affected sleep. The major festivals of the Norse calendar, Yule in midwinter, midsummer celebrations, harvest festivals, were times of feasting and celebration that disrupted normal sleep patterns. People would stay up late, drinking and eating and celebrating, and sleep would be delayed or shortened. But this was intentional, part of the festival experience, marking these times as special and different from ordinary days. Yule, the midwinter festival, was particularly significant. This was the darkest time of the year, when the sun barely rose and people lived mostly in darkness and firelight. The festival celebrated the turning point, the beginning of the sun's return, the promise of spring though it was still months away. There would be feasting on whatever special foods had been saved for the occasion, drinking of mead and ale, sacrifice to the gods, and celebrations that lasted for days. During Yule, normal routines were suspended. People slept when exhausted and woke when they chose or when called to some festival activity. There was a dreamlike quality to these midwinter days, the darkness and the celebration and the suspension of normal rules all combining to create an atmosphere both festive and somewhat otherworldly. Sleep during Yule might be deep and dreamless from exhaustion, or it might be troubled and vivid from rich food and strong drink and the highly charged emotional atmosphere. At midsummer, the opposite occurred. With the sun barely setting, people might hardly sleep at all, caught up in the celebration of light and warmth, in the joy of summer's abundance. Midsummer nights had their own magic, a brightness that seemed to invite wakefulness, and people would stay up through the brief twilight, celebrating, dancing, telling stories, making love. When sleep finally came, it might be brief, just a few hours before the demands of the day called people back to wakefulness. Harvest time was not a festival in the celebratory sense, but it had its own intensity. Everyone worked with urgent determination to bring in the crops before weather turned or before they spoiled. Sleep during harvest was abbreviated, secondary to the essential work. People would work until they could work no more, collapse into sleep wherever was convenient, then rise before dawn to continue. This period was physically punishing, but it was also limited, a few weeks of intensity, then relief. After harvest was complete, there would be a celebration of Thanksgiving, acknowledging the success of the agricultural year and giving offerings to the gods in gratitude. This celebration might involve more drinking and feasting, more disruption of normal sleep, but it was joyful disruption, relief, and gratitude expressed through communal celebration. Let us consider now the impact of warfare and raiding on sleep, for this was an important part of Norse culture, particularly for the men who went Viking. Preparation for a raid disrupted normal life and normal sleep. Men who were getting ready to sail would be preoccupied, anxious or excited or both, their minds racing with possibilities. They would check and recheck their weapons and supplies, make arrangements for their families in their absence, say their farewells. Sleep the night before departure might be difficult, troubled by anticipation and the knowledge that they might not return. During the voyage, as we have discussed, sleep was fragmented and uncomfortable. But there was also an adrenaline-fueled energy that sustained men through these hardships. The excitement of adventure, the possibility of wealth, the brotherhood with other warriors, these things kept spirits up even when bodies were tired and conditions were difficult. The raid itself, if successful, would bring an intense rush, the violence of combat, the triumph of victory, the acquisition of plunder. Afterward, if there was time before departure, men might sleep heavily, the adrenaline draining away and leaving them exhausted. Or they might be too excited to sleep, too full of energy and battle joy to rest. They might celebrate with their companions, drinking and boasting, reliving the fight, counting their gains. The return voyage could be different depending on the outcome. If the raid had been successful and all had survived, the journey home might be almost festive, men anticipating the welcome they would receive, imagining the stories they would tell. Sleep would come more easily, though still fragmented by the demands of sailing. If the raid had gone poorly, if comrades had died or serious injuries occurred, the mood would be somber, and sleep might be troubled by grief and the replaying of events. Homecoming brought its own sleep challenges. Men returning from raiding had to readjust to domestic life, to the quieter rhythms of the farmstead, to sleeping in a warm house rather than on a ship or a beach. They might experience what we would now recognize as trauma responses, nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty relaxing. Their families would need to help them transition back, creating space for them to tell their stories, acknowledging what they had experienced, gradually reintegrating them into household routines. Some men found this transition difficult. The excitement and intensity of raiding could become addictive, making normal life seem dull by comparison. These men might become restless, unable to settle, counting the days until they could sail again. Their sleep might be poor, disturbed by this restlessness, by the tension between their domestic responsibilities and their desire for adventure. Others transitioned more easily, glad to be home, content with peaceful farming life between expeditions. Women, too, experienced these disruptions. When their men were gone, women carried additional responsibilities, managing the farmstead alone or with limited help. They might sleep more lightly, listening for problems, worried about the absent men, bearing the weight of uncertainty. When the men returned, there was adjustment in the other direction, re-establishing patterns of shared responsibility and shared space, including shared sleeping arrangements. Let us speak now of the role of animals in relation to sleep, for the Norse relationship with animals was intimate and important. Livestock were essential to survival, and their care structured human routines including sleep. Cows needed to be milked morning and evening, which meant that someone had to rise at a particular time regardless of how well they had slept. Sheep needed to be checked on, especially during lambing season when someone might need to stay up through the night to assist with difficult births. Chickens needed to be let out in the morning and secured in the evening against foxes and other predators. These animal rhythms became human rhythms. A farmer learned to wake with the animals, to read their sounds and know whether all was well or something required attention. The lowing of a cow in distress would bring a household member instantly awake and moving to investigate. The frantic cackling of chickens would signal a predator and demand immediate response. These were not disruptions to sleep but rather part of the fabric of agricultural life, expected and accepted. Dogs were common in Norse households, serving as guards, hunting companions, and herders. A good dog would alert the household to approaching strangers or predators, barking to raise the alarm. This allowed people to sleep with somewhat less anxiety, knowing that the dog would warn them of danger. Dogs might sleep inside the longhouse, near the door or in a corner, or they might sleep outside in the doorway or in a separate shelter. Their presence was reassuring, another layer of protection against the night's uncertainties. Cats were also kept, primarily for rodent control. A good mouser was valuable, protecting stored grain and food from mice and rats. Cats would prowl the longhouse at night, hunting, and their presence was welcomed. Sometimes a cat would choose to sleep with a particular person, curling up in the furs, providing warmth and companionship. This was considered lucky, a sign that the household spirits approved. Horses were particularly valued animals, almost sacred in Norse culture. A good horse was a significant investment, a source of transportation and status, sometimes even buried with its owner as a companion for the journey to the afterlife. Horses were usually kept in separate stables, but they required care that affected human sleep schedules. Someone needed to check on them regularly, ensure they had food and water, watch for illness or injury. In very cold weather, horses might be brought into the longhouse itself, their body heat helping to warm the space while they benefited from the shelter and warmth provided by the human inhabitants. The seasonal movements of livestock also affected sleep patterns. In spring, when animals were taken to summer pastures, someone had to accompany them, living rough in a shelter or temporary camp, sleeping outdoors or in primitive conditions. This was often the work of adolescents or young adults, and it was seen as character building despite its hardships. Learning to sleep in the open, to manage animals away from the security of the home farmstead, to be self-reliant and alert, these were valuable skills that the summer grazing period taught. In autumn, when the animals were brought back, there was relief in returning to more comfortable sleeping arrangements. But this was also the time when many animals were slaughtered for winter food, and the work of butchering, preserving, and storing meat was intensive and urgent. Sleep again became secondary to essential tasks, though everyone knew this period would pass and winter's slower pace would allow for rest. Let us consider the acoustics of the longhouse more carefully, for the sounds of sleep in such a space were distinctive and significant. The building itself was alive with small noises, the settling of timbers as temperature changed, the rustle of the turf roof in the wind, the scurrying of mice despite the cat's best efforts. These sounds were familiar, their absence more alarming than their presence. A structure that was completely silent was a structure that might have some problem, some damage that needed attention. The fire, as we have noted repeatedly, was a constant source of sound and light. But fires have individual personalities, depending on the wood being burned, the configuration of the logs, the draw of air through the building. A fire might crackle pleasantly, or pop and hiss, or roar with a deep steady rumble. Experienced people could read a fire by its sound, knowing when it needed attention, when it was burning well, when the wood was too wet or the draft was wrong. Human sounds during sleep were varied and sometimes amusing. Snoring was common, particularly among older men, and it could be quite loud. This was tolerated, though sometimes the source of gentle teasing during the day. People with particularly severe snoring might be situated in sleeping positions where they would disturb the fewest others, or family members learn to sleep through it, the way people learn to sleep through any consistent background noise. Sleep talking was noted and sometimes remembered, becoming stories told the next day. The Norse believed that sometimes sleep talking revealed truths the speaker would not admit while awake, or that it reflected messages from dreams. If someone said something particularly interesting or revealing while asleep, it would be discussed and interpreted. This was not seen as an invasion of privacy but rather as another source of information about the spiritual and psychological states of household members. Teeth grinding, sleepwalking, and other sleep disorders existed then as now, though they were understood differently. Sleepwalking was particularly concerning, for it suggested that the person's soul was traveling while their body tried to follow. This was seen as potentially dangerous, and various protective measures might be taken: prayers, charms, sometimes physical restraints to prevent the sleepwalker from leaving the house and coming to harm. The causes were understood as spiritual rather than neurological, but the concern for the person's safety was genuine and practical regardless of the explanation. Night terrors, particularly in children, were attributed to malevolent spirits or to frightening experiences that the child's mind was trying to process. A child who woke screaming would be comforted immediately, held and soothed, reassured that they were safe. Sometimes additional protective rituals would be performed, prayers said, a charm placed under the child's sleeping place, offerings made to the household spirits. These measures helped the parents feel they were doing something to protect their child, and probably helped the child as well through the reassurance and attention they provided. Let us turn now to consider the Norse understanding of time as it related to sleep. The Norse did not have clocks as we know them. Time was measured by the sun's position, by the changing light, by the stages of various tasks. There were names for different parts of the day and night: early morning, mid-morning, midday, afternoon, evening, night, midnight, and so on. But these were approximate, flexible, based on observation rather than precise measurement. This meant that sleep was not scheduled in the rigid way we might schedule it. People did not decide, I will sleep from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Rather, they slept when darkness and tiredness indicated it was time to sleep, and woke when light and readiness indicated it was time to wake. This was a more natural rhythm, more in tune with the body's actual needs and with the changing seasons, than our modern approach of forcing sleep into a predetermined schedule regardless of natural cues. The length of the night varied dramatically with season and latitude. In the far north during winter, night could last 20 hours or more, while in summer, twilight might persist all night with no real darkness. People's sleep adjusted to match these conditions. In winter's long darkness, they slept more, their bodies responding to the extended period of low light by producing more melatonin and feeling naturally drowsy for longer periods. In summer's brightness, they slept less, their bodies stimulated by the constant light to remain active. This flexibility in sleep duration was possible because the Norse lifestyle allowed for it. There was no factory to arrive at precisely at 8 a.m., no boss watching the clock to ensure punctuality. Work was task-based rather than time-based. One worked until the task was done, the field plowed, the nets hauled, the meal prepared, and then moved on to the next task or to rest. If someone had slept poorly and was exhausted, they might work more slowly or take breaks, and this was acceptable as long as essential tasks were completed. There were, of course, some time-sensitive activities. Tides affected fishing and sailing, so boats had to leave when the tide was right regardless of how well the crew had slept. Certain agricultural tasks were best done at particular times of day, hay cutting in the morning after the dew dried, for example. But even these constraints were more flexible than modern scheduling, and people could adapt to them without the chronic sleep deprivation that affects so many in our era. The concept of being on time in the modern sense did not really exist. If someone said they would arrive tomorrow, they meant sometime during the tomorrow's daylight hours, not at a specific minute. If a gathering was planned for evening, people would arrive when evening came, as they judged it, and there was no precise start time to be late for. This looser relationship with time removed a source of anxiety that disrupts modern sleep, the constant worry about schedules, deadlines, appointments that must be kept at specific moments. Let us consider now how the Norse thought about dreams and their meanings, for this was a significant aspect of their sleep culture. Dreams were not dismissed as random neural activity but were seen as meaningful, as windows into other realities or previews of future events. Different types of dreams had different significance. Clear, vivid dreams were considered more important than vague, confused ones. Dreams that repeated or that seemed to carry emotional weight demanded attention and interpretation. Some dreams were straightforward messages from the gods. A person might dream of Odin or Thor or Freya, and the god might speak to them directly, offering advice or warning or a task to accomplish. These dreams were taken very seriously. The dreamer would share them with household members and possibly with wider community, and decisions might be made based on the dream's content. To ignore such a dream would be disrespectful to the gods and potentially dangerous. Other dreams were symbolic, requiring interpretation. A dream of a great tree might represent Yggdrasil, the world tree, and thus connect to larger cosmic concerns. A dream of a ship might relate to a journey, literal or metaphorical. A dream of weapons might presage conflict. The Norse had a complex vocabulary of dream symbols, built up over generations, that helped in interpretation. But symbols could also be personal, meaningful to the individual dreamer in ways that might not be obvious to others. Prophetic dreams were particularly valued. These dreams showed future events, sometimes clearly, sometimes in veiled symbolic form. A person might dream of their own death or the death of others, and would take measures to prepare or to try to avert the foreseen outcome. Though the Norse believed strongly in fate, they also believed that knowing the future allowed for better responses to it, for meeting one's destiny with preparedness and honor rather than being caught by surprise. Dreams could also be visits from the dead. An ancestor might appear in a dream to offer advice, to warn of danger, to request that certain actions be taken. These dreams were bittersweet, comforting because they allowed contact with the lost loved one, but also sometimes disturbing in their intensity and their demands. A person who repeatedly dreamed of a particular ancestor might make special offerings at the ancestor's grave mound, seeking to understand what the ancestor wanted or to ease whatever restlessness was causing the dreams. Nightmares were understood as attacks by malevolent spirits, particularly by a type of being called a mara or mare. This creature would sit on the sleeper's chest, causing the sensation of paralysis and difficulty breathing that we now recognize as sleep paralysis. The dreamer might feel they were awake but unable to move, might see frightening visions, might experience intense fear. Protective measures against the mare included saying certain prayers before sleep, placing iron near the bed, or marking protective runes on the sleeping area. The Norse also recognized that physical conditions could affect dreams. Eating heavy food before sleep was known to cause disturbing dreams. Sleeping in an uncomfortable position might lead to dreams that reflected the physical discomfort, dreams of being trapped or weighted down. Illness often brought fever dreams, vivid and strange, and these were understood to reflect the body's struggle with sickness rather than necessarily carrying prophetic meaning. There were practices for encouraging good dreams or specific types of dreams. Someone seeking guidance might say a prayer to a particular god before sleep, asking for a dream that would show them what to do. A Volva or other spiritual practitioner might induce prophetic dreams through ritual and possibly through the use of certain herbs, though the details of these practices are largely lost to us. The boundary between sleep and trance, between ordinary dreaming and the deliberately induced visions of spiritual practitioners, was not always clear, and this ambiguity was accepted as part of the mystery of consciousness and the spirit world. Let us speak now of the practical wisdom the Norse accumulated about achieving good sleep, for they understood through experience what helped and what hindered rest. Fresh air was recognized as important. Despite the cold, houses were ventilated to some degree, preventing the atmosphere from becoming too stuffy and stale. In summer, doors and windows might be left open during the day to air out the longhouse, replacing the accumulated odors of winter with fresh, clean air. Regular physical activity was understood to promote good sleep. A body that had worked hard during the day was ready to rest at night. Conversely, if someone was unable to work due to illness or injury and had to remain inactive, they often found sleep more difficult. The Norse did not have our concept of exercise as a separate activity, but they understood that the body needed movement and exertion to function well, including to sleep well. Routine was also valuable. Going to bed at roughly the same time each night, following similar pre-sleep rituals, sleeping in the same spot, these regularities helped the body and mind prepare for sleep. When routine was disrupted by travel or unusual circumstances, sleep often suffered, and people looked forward to returning to their normal patterns. Managing worry and anxiety was recognized as important for sleep, though the methods used were different from modern techniques. Prayer and offerings to the gods could help a worried person feel they had done what they could to influence outcomes. Talking through problems with family or trusted friends could help process worries and reduce their power. Accepting that some things were beyond one's control, surrendering to WYRD or fate, could bring peace that allowed for rest. The Norse also understood the relationship between sleep and health more broadly. They recognized that sick people needed more sleep, that recovery required rest. They saw that people who consistently slept poorly were more prone to illness, were more irritable, were less able to work effectively. While they lacked our scientific understanding of sleep's role in immune function and cellular repair, they understood empirically that sleep and health were deeply connected. There was wisdom, too, about napping. A brief rest during the day, particularly after the midday meal, was seen as restorative. This was especially common in summer when nights were short and total sleep time was reduced. An hour or so of rest in the middle of the day allowed people to continue working through the long summer evening. Children and the elderly especially were encouraged to nap, recognizing their greater need for rest. Let us consider now the transitions, the moments when someone moved from sleeping life into death, or from one phase of life into another, and how these transitions were marked and understood. When a person was clearly dying, family would gather, keeping vigil. This vigil might last hours or days, depending on how the death unfolded. People would take turns sleeping, ensuring someone was always awake and present. This presence was important. The dying person should not be alone, should know they were surrounded by love and care as they made their final transition. After death, the body would be prepared for burial or cremation. This preparation often took place in the longhouse itself, in the same space where the person had lived and slept. The body would be washed, dressed in good clothing, arranged in a position of repose. Grave goods would be selected, weapons for a warrior, tools for a craftsperson, jewelry, and household items for a woman. These objects would accompany the person into death, helping them in the afterlife. The funeral itself was a significant event, bringing together the community. There would be feasting and drinking, stories told about the deceased, their accomplishments celebrated, their place in the family and community honored. This gathering served multiple functions. It honored the dead, it supported the grieving family, it reaffirmed community bonds, and it celebrated life even in the face of death. After the funeral, life would gradually return to normal, though the absence of the person would be felt, particularly at night when their sleeping place remained empty. Birth was another major transition, and it affected household sleep significantly. A woman in labor might labor through the night, attended by other women, her mother if she was alive and nearby, sisters, friends, perhaps a midwife who was skilled in assisting births. The men would typically be kept away from this female space, though they might remain awake and anxious, waiting for news. When the baby finally arrived, there would be joy and relief, but also exhaustion for all involved. The days and weeks following birth were a time of adjustment. The new mother needed extra rest to recover from the ordeal of giving birth. She would be cared for by other women, given nourishing foods, encouraged to sleep when the baby slept. Her nighttime sleep would be badly fragmented for weeks or months as she nursed the infant. The household would adjust around this, others taking on her usual tasks, maintaining quiet around her sleeping area, supporting her through this demanding time. Marriages, too, brought transitions in sleeping arrangements. When a couple married, they would typically establish their sleeping space together, either in a new household if they could afford to build one, or within the longhouse of one of their families. The wedding night itself was significant, marking the beginning of their intimate physical relationship. There were various customs around this, sometimes ribald, with friends and family making jokes and teasing the couple, sometimes more solemn and ritualistic, with blessings and prayers for fertility and happiness. The early days of marriage involved learning to sleep with another person, adjusting to their presence, their movements, their rhythms. Some couples adapted easily, finding comfort in the closeness. Others needed time to get used to sharing sleep space. But this adjustment was expected, part of the process of becoming a married couple, building a life together. As couples aged together, their sleeping patterns often synchronized. They would wake and sleep at similar times, each attuned to the other's rhythms. The loss of a long-term spouse was thus especially difficult, for it disrupted not just emotional bonds but also the physical patterns of decades. A widow or widower might find sleep elusive, the empty space beside them a constant reminder of loss, their body still expecting the presence of the partner who was no longer there. Let us reflect now on what the Norse experience of sleep can teach us, we who live in such a different world. We have so much that they lacked: climate control, comfortable mattresses, electric lights that banish darkness, medical knowledge that prevents many of the ailments that troubled them. Yet we also lack much that they had, particularly in the realm of sleep. We lack the natural rhythms that govern their rest, the alignment with seasons and sunlight, the flexibility to sleep when tired and wake when rested. The Norse relationship with sleep was fundamentally different from ours because their entire relationship with time was different. Time was not money to them, not a resource to be maximized and exploited. Time was simply the medium in which life occurred, and sleep was a natural, essential part of life, not an inconvenience to be minimized. They did not see sleep as wasted time but as necessary time, as time when the body repaired itself, when the spirit traveled and learned, when rest prepared one for the demands of waking life. They also had a communal approach to sleep that most of us have lost. We value privacy in our culture, often sleeping alone or only with a partner, in rooms designed to block out the world. The Norse slept surrounded by family, by community, connected even in unconsciousness. This brought its own challenges, certainly, less privacy, more disturbance, but it also brought security, warmth, connection. There was something deeply human about their approach, something that spoke to our social nature as a species. The Norse acceptance of seasonal variation in sleep is particularly relevant to our modern struggles. We try to maintain the same schedule year-round, the same bedtimes and wake times regardless of whether the sun is setting at 4 p.m. or 10 p.m. We fight against our biology with alarm clocks and artificial light, forcing ourselves into patterns that may serve our modern economy but do not serve our bodies well. The Norse approach, sleeping more in winter, less in summer, letting the body follow its natural inclinations, was healthier, more aligned with how humans evolved to function. Their understanding that sleep had spiritual dimensions is also worth considering. Whether or not we believe in their specific religious framework, there is something valuable in seeing sleep as more than just mechanical rest. Sleep is when we dream, when our unconscious minds process the day's experiences, when our brains consolidate memories and solve problems. It is mysterious, this nightly journey into altered consciousness, and treating it with some reverence, as the Norse did, might help us value it more highly and prioritize it better. The Norse practices around bedtime, the gradual transition, the storytelling and conversation, the gentle winding down from the day's activities, stand in stark contrast to our modern habit of staring at screens until the moment we try to sleep, flooding our brains with blue light and stimulating content. The Norse approach was wiser. They gave their minds and bodies time to prepare for sleep, creating rituals and routines that signaled it was time to rest. This made falling asleep easier, made sleep itself more restful. Their communal sleeping arrangements might not suit us now, but the principle behind them, that sleep is a shared human experience, that we can support each other in rest as we do in other aspects of life, is worth considering. Perhaps this is part of why many people sleep better with a partner, or why children often sleep better when they know their parents are near. We are social creatures, and even in sleep, connection matters. Now, as we approach the end of our journey through the sleeping lives of the Norse people, let us paint one final picture, a synthesis of all we have explored. Imagine a lone house on a winter's night, somewhere in Norway in the 10th century. Outside, snow falls softly, steadily, muffling all sound. The wind is calm for once, granting a respite from its usual howling. The darkness is absolute, broken only by the faint shimmer of stars when clouds part briefly. Inside, the longhouse is warm and dimly lit. The fire in the central hearth burns low, carefully banked to last through the night, its red glow pulsing gently with the breathing of the flames. Along the walls, the sleeping benches are occupied. The household has settled for the night, finishing the last conversations, saying the last prayers, making the last adjustments to blankets and furs. The head of the household lies in his place with his wife beside him, their bodies close together after years of shared sleep. His breathing is already deep and regular. He fell asleep quickly, as he always does, exhausted from a day spent repairing tools and checking on the animals through the snow. His wife lies awake a few minutes longer, as she often does, listening to the household, ensuring all is well. She hears her children breathing in their sleeping spaces, 3 sons and 2 daughters, ranging from 6 to 17. All are present, all are safe, all are settling into sleep. The eldest son shifts in his sleep, muttering something unintelligible, then falling silent again. The youngest daughter sighs contentedly, curled up in her furs with one hand near her face. The middle children are already deeply asleep, as children sleep, utterly surrendered to rest. Near the door, the household's 2 thralls occupy their less comfortable positions, but they too are drifting towards sleep, grateful for warmth and shelter even if their bedding is sparse. The wife's mother, an old woman of perhaps 60 winters, ancient by the standards of that time and place, breathes with a slight wheeze from her place near the fire. She had a difficult day, her joints aching from the cold, but she is comfortable now, wrapped in extra furs, her sleeping space carefully arranged to support her aging body. She is not quite asleep yet either, her mind wandering through memories, through thoughts of those long dead, through prayers to the gods and ancestors. Soon, though, she too will sleep. The fire pops once, sending up a small shower of sparks that quickly fade. One of the dogs, lying near the door, raises its head briefly, ears pricked, listening. After a moment, satisfied that all is well, it settles back down. The cats are somewhere in the darkness, prowling for mice, their eyes catching the faint firelight and gleaming for a moment before they move on. The woman, finally satisfied that her family is safe and settled, closes her eyes. Her mind releases its vigilance, drifts. She thinks briefly of the next day's tasks, but the thoughts slide away, too slippery to hold. She feels her husband's warmth beside her, hears the beloved sounds of her children's breathing, feels the weight of the furs over her. She is safe. They are safe. All is well. Sleep comes, gentle and natural, like fog rolling in from the sea. Her breathing slows, deepens, joins the rhythm of the household. One by one, they have all surrendered now, all crossed the threshold from waking into sleep. The longhouse is full of the sound of breathing, of small movements and adjustments, of the crackling fire and the occasional sound from the animals. It is peaceful, this communal sleep, this shared rest. Outside, the snow continues to fall, building up on the turf roof, adding another layer of insulation against the cold. The world is asleep, the animals in their dens and burrows, the birds silent in the trees, even the fish moving slowly beneath the ice. This is winter's rest, the great pause, when all of nature waits for the sun's return. Inside the longhouse, dreams begin. The old woman dreams of her youth, of her own mother teaching her to weave, of a sunny day decades ago when everything was possible. The eldest son dreams of sailing, of standing at the prow of a ship as it cuts through waves, of distant lands he has only heard of in stories. The youngest daughter dreams of the cat, of chasing it through flowers that do not exist in the real world, of laughter and sunlight. The thralls dream their own dreams, private and unknown, perhaps of freedom, perhaps simply of warmth and food and safety. The fire burns lower, but someone will wake in a few hours, perhaps the father, perhaps the eldest son, and will add wood, ensuring warmth continues through the night. The rhythms continue, the cycles of sleep and waking that have continued for as long as humans have existed, that will continue long after this particular household has been forgotten. This was how the Norse slept, not perfectly, not always comfortably, but well enough, in harmony with the seasons and the land, surrounded by family and community, accepting rest as the gift it was. They understood something essential about being human, about the necessity of surrender, about the wisdom of the body. They worked hard, but they also rested well. They lived lives of considerable hardship by our standards, but in the realm of sleep, they may have been richer than we are. And so we come to the end of our journey, our exploration of rest in the world of the Norse. We have walked through their homes, felt the warmth of their fires, wrapped ourselves in their furs, listened to their stories, shared their sleeping spaces. We have seen how they honored sleep, how they understood it, how they made space for it in lives that were full of labor and challenge. Perhaps, kind listener, you have found something here that speaks to you, some wisdom from this distant time that might be applied to your own rest. Perhaps you will think differently about your own sleep, will value it more highly, will make changes that allow you to rest more deeply, more peacefully. Or perhaps these stories have simply been companions for your own drift toward sleep, gentle voices in the darkness, helping you transition from the concerns of the day into the peace of night. Whatever brought you here, wherever you are as you listen to these words, know that you are part of a continuum, a chain that stretches back through time to those Norse sleepers in their longhouses, and further back still to the first humans who ever laid down to rest. Sleep is our shared inheritance, our nightly return to something essential and ancient. It connects us all, across time, across cultures, across all the differences that seem to divide us. The Norse understood this. They honored sleep not just as a biological necessity but as a sacred part of life, a time of vulnerability and trust, a journey into mystery. They wrapped their families in furs and gathered around their fires and told their stories and surrendered each night to something larger than themselves. In this, they were wise. And now, as the darkness gathers and the day releases its hold, as your breathing slows and your eyes grow heavy, you too can make this surrender. You can release the day's concerns, can trust that all will be well, can allow yourself to rest. The world will turn without you for these hours. Your body will repair and renew itself. Your mind will process and dream and heal. And when morning comes, you will wake refreshed, ready to meet whatever the new day brings. Sleep well, kind listener. Sleep deeply and peacefully. Let the stories of the Norse and their restful nights be a lullaby carrying you gently into dreams. Know that you are safe, that you are connected to something ancient and essential, that rest is your birthright and your gift. Close your eyes now, and let yourself drift, like a Viking ship on a calm sea, into the peaceful harbor of sleep. The fire burns low. The night is deep. All is well. Rest now. Rest.